Marie Antoinette became Queen of France at 18 years old, and for her entire adult life she was almost never alone. Every meal, every article of clothing, and every hour of her day followed rules that had been fixed generations before she was born. From the outside, her position appeared to be extraordinary privilege. In practice, most of it took place in front of an audience, governed by procedures so specific that even a queen could not choose when to put on her own underwear. The court surrounding her at Versailles numbered in the thousands, and to nearly everyone living inside that system, these procedures were simply how a monarchy functioned, not spectacle. Some of the customs attached to her name over the years turned out to be exaggeration or invention added long after her death. Most of them were real, recorded at the time by people who lived through them, and stranger than the legend that followed. This is a look at the daily reality the portraits do not show, the parts of her life that counted as completely normal at the time and would be considered bizarre by almost any modern standard. Marie Antoinette was 14 years old when she left Vienna to marry the future King of France, and the journey itself was designed to erase where she came from. Her procession made stops at abbeys and courts across the Holy Roman Empire before reaching the French border at a small island in the Rhine near Kehl, chosen because it sat directly across from Strasbourg and offered a convenient midway point for the handover. There, inside a building constructed specifically for the occasion, she was undressed completely and redressed head to toe in clothing made in France, since clothing had always been a powerful signifier of nationality. Nothing Austrian continued into France with her. Her fine clothes, her entourage, and even her favorite dog were left behind, with only a single official permitted to continue with her. According to her own attendant, later known as Madame Campan, the point of the entire ritual was that the bride would retain nothing from a foreign court. Despite the thoroughness of the handover, the French court never fully accepted her as one of its own. Within her first years at Versailles, hostile courtiers had already given her the nickname l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, despite her formal shedding of Austria at the border. On the other side of that room, Marie Antoinette met the Comtesse de Noailles, the noblewoman placed in charge of her behavior at court, and later gave her a nickname that stuck for years at Versailles, Madame Etiquette. The nickname turned out to be accurate. Enforcing an enormous detailed rule-book of court behavior was this woman's actual job, and getting around it became one of Marie Antoinette's most consistent private projects. Even before her marriage was consummated, Marie Antoinette learned that refusing to speak to someone could count as a real diplomatic act at Versailles. The reigning king, Louis XV, kept an official mistress, Madame du Barry, who held genuine influence at court, and courtiers hostile to du Barry convinced the 14-year-old Dauphine to refuse to acknowledge her existence in any way. The conflict had roots that predated her arrival. Du Barry had already helped force the dismissal of a minister named Choiseul, the same man who had arranged the Franco-Austrian marriage in the first place, and du Barry had also been publicly insulted at the theater by ladies attending the new Dauphine. As a much younger girl meeting du Barry for the first time, before she understood the nature of the relationship, Marie Antoinette had innocently remarked that she intended to become the king's rival too, since she also wished to please him. For close to 2 years afterward, Marie Antoinette would not say a single word directly to du Barry, even while sitting near her at card games several evenings a week. Her mother in Vienna, Empress Maria Theresa, treated the standoff as a genuine threat to the alliance between France and Austria, and pressured her daughter for months, through letters and through the Austrian ambassador, to end it. On New Year's Day in 1772, in front of a room full of courtiers, Marie Antoinette finally turned toward du Barry and delivered a single, flat sentence. There are many people at Versailles today. That one unremarkable line, spoken once, was treated by 2 royal courts as a resolved crisis. The marriage itself became a matter of public concern. The wedding took place on May 16, 1770, in the Royal Chapel at Versailles, and ended, as royal weddings did at the time, with a ceremonial bedding, the couple placed together in front of members of the court. What followed was not treated as a private matter. For the next 7 years, the marriage was not physically completed, and the reasons why became a matter of state, discussed in letters passed between monarchs and ambassadors across Europe. A childless queen faced real political risk, since an unconsummated marriage could still be legally annulled under French custom, and Marie Antoinette's entire position in the country rested on eventually producing an heir. Her own sister-in-law, married to the king's youngest brother, had already delivered 2 healthy sons during this same period, and Marie Antoinette, required by etiquette to attend those births herself, felt her own childlessness as both a political and personal humiliation. Maria Theresa wrote letter after letter demanding details, while her ambassador in France sent private reports back to Vienna on the subject. In 1777, Marie Antoinette's older brother, Emperor Joseph II, visited Versailles and afterward wrote frankly to their brother Leopold about the physical mechanics of the marriage bed, details of the couple's intimate life that still survive in his correspondence today. The visit apparently worked. The marriage was consummated later that year, and by the end of 1778, Marie Antoinette was expecting her first child, roughly 8 years after her wedding day. Even something as basic as getting dressed followed a hierarchy few people today would recognize as normal. Each morning, Marie Antoinette's attendants gathered for a ceremony called the lever, split into an early, smaller stage, open only to those holding what the court called major rights, the highest tier of nobility, followed by a larger version open to a wider group holding lesser rights, all of it structured around a strict ranking of who was permitted to touch which piece of her clothing. The highest-ranking noblewoman present had the right to hand the queen her chemise, and if someone of even higher rank walked in partway through, the garment already in progress was passed backward through the sequence of hands until it reached the newcomer, who then handed it forward again from the top. According to the record left by her household, Marie Antoinette once stood completely undressed in the cold waiting for her shift, while a princess of the blood who had just entered slowly removed her gloves before taking her place in the handoff. Then, a second princess arrived, and the same delay happened again. It was a routine absurd enough that Marie Antoinette abolished this exact version of it for herself once she became queen, though the underlying system of ranked access to her wardrobe never fully disappeared. Court etiquette also required her to change dresses 3 separate times a day, one for morning mass, one for the afternoon, and one elaborate gown for evening entertainment, and technically forbade wearing the same dress twice. Her clothing was stored across 3 separate rooms at the palace, and her allowance covered roughly 3 dozen new gowns for winter and another 3 dozen for summer, along with 18 pairs of scented gloves and 4 new pairs of shoes every week. Her dressmaker, Rose Burton, visited twice a week with new fabric samples, and grew close enough to the queen that courtiers started referring to her, half-jokingly, as the Minister of Fashion. Meals came with an audience of their own. The Grand Couvert was a public dinner held at Versailles that almost anyone could attend to watch the royals eat, provided men showed up with a hat and a sword, both of which could be rented from vendors at the gates if a visitor arrived without them. Spectators filed past in near silence while the royal family worked through a long, formal, multi-course meal treated more as a public viewing than an actual dinner. Service was often chaotic despite the formality surrounding it, and special dishes prepared for the royal table sometimes went missing before they arrived, quietly eaten by a servant instead. Every person of rank attending court, regardless of gender, was expected to have their hair powdered for these occasions, a process that involved draping a protective cape over the shoulders before blowing powder directly onto the head. Marie Antoinette herself once wrote to her mother that she and her husband tried to eat quickly enough to end the display sooner. The most ordinary moments of a day, dressing, undressing, and eating, were treated as belonging to the crown rather than to the person doing them. Nowhere was that idea taken further than in the birthing room. French royal custom required queens to give birth in front of witnesses, a rule going back to Louis XIV, meant to guarantee that no living baby was secretly substituted for a stillbirth, and that no substitution or trickery of any kind reached the throne. As Marie Antoinette's labor approached in December of 1778, prayers were already being offered in cathedrals across France, and the royal family had begun sleeping in rooms adjoining hers more than a week before she actually gave birth. When the moment finally came, on December 19th, the palace filled with spectators almost immediately. Contemporary accounts describe a swarm of up to 200 onlookers crowding into the room, a mix of titled nobility and ordinary members of the public who held rights of entry. According to her chambermaid's later account, the crowd rushing in was so numerous and tumultuous that it was feared the queen herself would be hurt, and two men even climbed onto the furniture for a better view. The heat and pressure of so many bodies caused Marie Antoinette to lose consciousness once the baby was delivered, and the windows had to be forced open for air before a doctor revived her, following the standard medical response of the era: bloodletting. The child was a girl, Marie Thérèse, a disappointment by the strict standards of royal succession, but no less dangerous an ordeal for the queen who had just survived it. Afterward, Louis XVI reduced the number of spectators allowed at her next 3 deliveries, though royal births kept an audience for the rest of her time as queen. Fashion had its own extreme, fully normalized excess. Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, Léonard Autier, built towering hairstyles known as poufs, constructed around a light, flexible wire frame, padded with a firm cushion of wool, horsehair, or linen, then covered with a combination of the wearer's own hair pulled up over the base and false hair pieces. Finished poufs regularly stood 2 to 3 feet above the head, and some accounts describe styles closer to 4 feet. One of her most famous poufs, created to celebrate a French naval victory, included a miniature ship complete with masts, rigging, and tiny cannons, mounted on top of her hair. Other poufs express political or personal meaning rather than celebration. When Louis XV chose to be inoculated against smallpox, a medical procedure many at court still considered dangerous, Marie Antoinette wore a pouf built around an olive tree and a serpent symbolizing medicine. A single styling session with Léonard could cost the modern equivalent of several $100s, at a time when an average Parisian laborer earned only a few dollars a day, meaning one afternoon of hairstyling could equal months of an ordinary worker's income, and Marie Antoinette had her hair restyled by Léonard nearly every day for years. Because the finished styles took hours to build and were meant to last a week or more without being redone, women who wore them slept sitting upright using purpose-built wooden or porcelain neck supports to keep the structure from collapsing overnight. Carriages became a genuine problem to navigate, and riders were sometimes required to kneel on the floor or hold the hairstyle out through the window just to fit through the door. The style was rarely washed during the week or two it stayed in place, and the pomade used to hold it together was known to attract vermin. Marie Antoinette's own mother wrote from Vienna to complain about the height of her hair, noting that it had reportedly reached 3 feet from the roots once the feathers and ribbons were added. Her daughter kept wearing it anyway. In 1783, Marie Antoinette had an entire village built for her private use. Located near a smaller residence on the Versailles grounds called the Petit Trianon, the Hameau de la Reine consisted of 12 cottages arranged around an artificial lake, built to resemble rural Norman or Flemish architecture. For generations afterward, it was described as a place where the queen and her friends dressed up and pretended to be peasants, milking cows for entertainment. That specific claim is not supported by any contemporary record from her own lifetime, and the myth appears to trace back to building names added long after her death during the First Empire period. What is documented is strange in a different way. The hamlet was a fully working farm, with a professional farmer and a staff that included gardeners, a rat catcher, and a mole catcher, producing real fruit, vegetables, and dairy that were consumed at the queen's own table. One building included a mill wheel that was purely decorative and never used for grinding, while a tower overlooking the lake was named after a popular song of the day rather than any historical figure. Several of the cottages had plain, weathered exteriors that concealed fully furnished interiors, complete with tapestry-covered walls, a billiard room, and a harpsichord the queen liked to play. She wore simple muslin dresses and straw hats while visiting the property, plain-looking clothing that was nonetheless tailored and costly, and used the site to walk with a small circle of friends away from the formal court. The hamlet cost roughly 500,000 livres to build, a considerable sum, though still only a fraction of the 6 million livres spent on a single royal chateau around the same period. A queen paid architects and laborers to build an entire working farm disguised as a poor village, so she could walk through it for a few hours at a time without being watched by thousands of courtiers. Card games at Versailles ran for real money, and Marie Antoinette played often enough that her chambers became a haunt for card sharps and professional gamblers, despite games of chance being formally banned at Versailles by her own husband. She had been trained to gamble as a child in Austria specifically so she would not be an easy target once she reached adulthood. As her debts grew, Louis XVI eventually forbade her from playing at all. She asked him for permission to play one final game before the ban took effect, and once he agreed, she made sure that single game went on for 3 days. She was far from the only member of the royal family with this problem. The king's own brother, the Comte d'Artois, ran up gambling debts that eventually reached 21 million livres, routinely settled by the king himself, and card games with names like Faro and Lansquenet ran for such high stakes at Versailles that professional players treated the palace as a genuine source of income. Combined with her spending on clothing, hairstyles, and building projects, Marie Antoinette's gambling debts helped attach a nickname to her that lasted the rest of her life among the French public, Madame Deficit, a label that blamed her personally for a level of national debt that had far more to do with decades of war than with any single queen's card table. No single event damaged her public reputation more than a scandal she had almost nothing to do with. In the mid-1780s, a con artist named Jean de la Motte convinced a cardinal named Rohan, who badly wanted to regain the queen's favor, that Marie Antoinette secretly wished to buy an extraordinarily expensive diamond necklace and needed his help arranging the purchase in secret. The necklace itself contained around 650 diamonds and had originally been designed years earlier for a different royal mistress entirely, before the king who commissioned it died and left the jewelers unable to find a buyer. La Motte forged letters in the queen's handwriting, staged a nighttime meeting between Rohan and a woman dressed to resemble Marie Antoinette in the dark, and convinced the cardinal to personally guarantee payment on the necklace, priced at roughly 1.6 million livres, in 4 installments over 2 years. Once the necklace was in hand, La Motte broke it apart and sold the diamonds individually. When the jewelers eventually approached the queen directly asking about payment, she had no idea what they meant, since she had already rejected the idea of buying the necklace herself, only to later have her signature forged on the paperwork. Rohan was arrested in the Hall of Mirrors, in front of the entire court. He was later acquitted at trial, which much of the public wrongly read as proof that the queen herself must have been involved. Her actual innocence made almost no difference to public opinion. A self-proclaimed occultist and friend of the cardinal, Count Cagliostro, had also been arrested in connection with the scheme, and though he too was acquitted, the king exiled him from France anyway. La Motte was convicted, sentenced to be whipped, branded, and imprisoned for life, and eventually escaped custody in disguise, fleeing to London, where she spent her final years publishing her own account of the affair, still blaming the queen. Pamphlets accusing Marie Antoinette of fraud and secret plotting multiplied for years afterward, and her public appearances declined sharply as a direct result. A scandal built entirely on forged paperwork and a stranger impersonating her in the dark became one of the events historians point to when explaining why the French public had turned against their queen years before the revolution began. By 1793, almost everything described here was gone. The palace, the hamlet, the towering hairstyles, and the private card tables belonged to a monarchy that no longer existed. Her husband had already been tried and executed that January. Months later, one of her closest friends, the Princesse de Lamballe, was killed by a mob, and the friend's head was carried through the streets on a pike and displayed outside the tower where Marie Antoinette was being held, though she was kept from actually seeing it directly. The stress of these years had already turned her hair white well before her later imprisonment at the conciergerie. She spent her final weeks in a small cell there, referred to by the guards only by a number, prisoner 280, allowed no privacy beyond a curtain a little over a meter high. She was tried before a revolutionary tribunal on charges that included treason and, most viciously, forced accusations involving her own young son, extracted from the 8-year-old under pressure from his captors. The trial lasted roughly 2 days. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. The night before her execution, she stayed awake writing a final letter to her sister-in-law, asking her to look after the children left behind. The letter never reached the person it was written for. On the morning of October 16, 1793, her hair was cut short and her hands were bound behind her back, and unlike her husband, who had ridden to his own execution the previous January inside a closed carriage, she was placed in an open cart and driven for close to an hour through the streets of Paris so the public could see her. She said almost nothing during the ride. At the scaffold she climbed the steps calmly, and after accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot, apologized to him directly. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." She was executed shortly after noon. The woman whose morning routine had once required a documented sequence of noble hands just to pass her a piece of clothing died in front of a crowd of strangers who had paid nothing and asked no one's permission to watch.